from New York, where it's just after 4 p.m. Good evening to everyone watching us from Central Europe, and good night to our viewers in Australia. Welcome to our live coverage. Tonight, we are looking at a story that sounds almost like something out of a Hollywood political thriller, but this time, it happened inside the world of the American presidency. Donald Trump was in Turkey for the NATO summit. A serious security threat reportedly emerged. And according to reports from the Washington Post and the New York Times, the president was secretly moved off Air Force One and transferred to a military aircraft. The goal was simple: make it impossible for anyone watching the airport to know exactly where the president was. But tonight, there is a much bigger question. If Donald Trump was moved to safety, who was left behind on the plane? And evenly, did those people know that the president was no longer on board? The question now generating intense debate in Washington. Let's go through what we know. According to the reported reconstruction, Trump preparing to leave Ankara aboard Air Force One. Everything appeared normal. The president was seen boarding the aircraft. The official presidential plane was ready to depart. But behind the scenes, the Secret Service reportedly received intelligence indicating a possible threat connected to Iran. The concern was not necessarily limited to Trump himself. The presidential aircraft could potentially have been targeted as well. And that is when an extraordinary security operation reportedly began. Instead of leaving Turkey on Air Force One, Trump was secretly moved through the airport using what has been described as a catering vehicle. The transfer was designed to attract as little attention as possible. Trump was then taken to a C-32, a military aircraft, a much smaller aircraft than Air Force One. And from there, he left Turkey. The strategy was essentially one of deception. Anyone watching the airport would have seen Air Force One. Anyone monitoring the president's movements could have assumed Trump was on that aircraft. But he wasn't. The president was somewhere else. From a purely protective standpoint, you can understand the logic. If security officials believe an assassination attempt could be underway, the first responsibility is to protect the president. But here's where the story becomes much more complicated. People remained aboard the aircraft that was apparently being used as the decoy. Journalists, members of the administration, staff, other personnel. And according to the reports, not everyone on board necessarily knew that Trump had already been moved. Think about that for a moment. The president is secretly removed from the aircraft because officials believe the plane could potentially be targeted. But the plane continues to exist as the visible presidential aircraft. And people are still inside. That raises an obvious question. Was Air Force One effectively being used as a decoy while other people remained on board? Again, we have to be careful here. We are not saying that the Secret Service intentionally put people in danger. We are not saying that an attack was actually imminent. And we are not saying that anyone deliberately sacrificed members of the president's staff. Those are serious allegations, and they require evidence. But the reported circumstances raise legitimate questions about risk. If the intelligence was serious enough to secretly move the president to another aircraft, what level of risk did the security services believe existed for everyone else? And who knew about it? That brings us to a fascinating precedent from another American presidency. Bill Clinton. Back in 2000, Clinton traveled to Pakistan at a time when the security environment was considered extremely dangerous. American officials were concerned about the possibility of an attack. And the Secret Service developed a deception strategy. Multiple aircraft were involved. The idea was to make it impossible for anyone watching from the ground to know exactly which aircraft was carrying the president. It was a classic presidential security tactic. There was an important difference. The operation was designed to protect Clinton without simply leaving his traveling partner knowingly exposed. And that historical comparison is now becoming increasingly important. Because the issue isn't whether presidents should be protected. Of course they should. The President of the United States is one of the highest value security targets on the planet. If credible intelligence indicates that the president could be attacked, the Secret Service has an obligation to act. The issue is what happens to everyone else. The staff, the military personnel, the Secret Service agents. The journalists. The people whose job requires them to travel with the president. Can they be placed inside a potential decoy operation without knowing what is happening? That is the political and ethical question. And it is a very serious one. There is another important element here. The journalists. The American press corps traditionally travels with the president. They provide independent coverage of presidential movements and events. Obviously, there are circumstances where journalists cannot be given sensitive security information. Nobody is suggesting that the Secret Service should emergency plan to the entire corps. But if journalists were sitting aboard an aircraft that security officials believed could potentially attract an attack, then questions about their safety become unavoidable. Were they informed? Were they protected? Did they know Trump was no longer on board? Or did they believe they were simply traveling with the president as usual? Those are questions that deserve answers. And then there is Donald Trump's own explanation. Trump has acknowledged that he was secretly transferred to another aircraft and said he followed the instructions of the Secret Service. Not surprising. When the Secret Service tells the president to move, the president moves. That's how presidential protection works. Trump has also made comments suggesting that the military aircraft he was transferred to could itself have been viewed as a potential target because an adversary might have assumed that was where the president was being taken. And that creates another fascinating question. If the second aircraft could have been perceived as the presidential aircraft, why was moving Trump onto it considered safer? The answer is obviously connected to deception. The whole point of the operation was to create uncertainty. An attacker shouldn't know which aircraft contains the president. The problem is that once you introduce multiple movements and multiple layers of deception, the risk calculation becomes incredibly complicated. Who is actually the target? Who is being used as the decoy? Who knows? And who doesn't? These questions become really important because this is not just about Donald Trump. This is about the American presidency. The United States has a long history of protecting presidents under extraordinary circumstances. Presidents have been moved secretly. Travel plans have been changed at the last minute. Motorcades have taken unexpected routes. Decoy vehicles and aircraft have been used. Security officials have gone to extraordinary lengths to prevent an attacker from knowing where the president is. That is nothing new. What makes this case different, if the reported details are confirmed, is the possibility that people accompanying the president may not have known that they were part of the deception. And that is where the political debate begins. Because there is a fundamental principle involved here. A president must be protected. But the people working for that president must also be protected. The staff cannot simply be treated as expendable. The journalists cannot simply be treated as expendable. Military personnel cannot simply be treated as expendable. And that is why the comparison with previous presidents matters. The question isn't, should Trump have stayed on Air Force One? Absolutely not. If the Secret Service believed that remaining on the aircraft created a serious threat, Trump should have been moved. The real question is, could the same level of protection have been provided to everyone else? And if not, why not? That is what Congress, journalists, and the American public may ultimately want to know. How serious was the Iranian threat? What intelligence triggered the operation? Who made the decision? Who was informed? Who was not informed? And what measures were taken to protect the people who remained aboard Air Force One? Those are not partisan questions. They are questions about presidential security. They are questions about responsibility. And they are questions about how far the government should go when protecting the commander-in-chief. There is also a broader issue of transparency. During an active security threat, secrecy is understandable. But once the danger has passed, democratic institutions still need accountability. The public deserves to know whether the operation was necessary, whether it was proportionate, and whether everyone involved was adequately protected. Because if this really was a sophisticated deception operation, then from one perspective it may have been a remarkable success. Trump survived. The adversary was allegedly denied reliable information about his location. The president reached safety. Mission accomplished. But from another perspective, the story raises a troubling possibility. If the people on the decoy aircraft didn't understand the risk they were facing, what if they were effectively part of a security operation without their knowledge? That is the issue critics are now focusing on. And it is why this story is unlikely to disappear anytime soon. Because at the center of this controversy is a very simple question. How much risk is acceptable when protecting the President of the United States? And does that answer change when the risk is being carried by someone other than the President? That's the debate. Not whether Donald Trump deserves protection. He absolutely does. Not whether the Secret Service should use deception. They have done that for decades. The debate is whether protecting the President can ever justify knowingly exposing other people to a danger they were not informed about. If the answer is yes, then the American public deserves to understand the circumstances. If the answer is no, then officials will have to explain exactly what happened in Ankara. Presidents come and go. Trump is in the White House today. Another president will eventually occupy that office. Whatever rules are established today could become the rules used tomorrow. So this isn't simply a Trump story. It's a story of the presidency of the United States. It's about the Secret Service. It's about presidential security. It's about the relationship between secrecy and accountability. And ultimately, it's about responsibility. A president should never be expected to ignore a credible threat. But neither should the people around him be treated as disposable pieces on a chessboard. That is why the details of what happened in Turkey matter. We need to know exactly what the intelligence agencies knew. We need to know how serious the threat was. We need to know who was informed. And we need to know what protections were put in place for everyone who remained on the aircraft. Because if Air Force One was being used as a decoy, then the question isn't simply whether the decoy worked. The question is, who was inside it? And that may ultimately be the most important question of this entire story. From New York, thank you for joining us. Good afternoon to our viewers here in the United States. Good evening to everyone watching from Europe. And good night to our viewers in Australia. Stay with us as we continue to follow this developing story and the questions surrounding Donald Trump's secret flight from Turkey. I'm Ellie, and this is our live coverage. Thank you for watching.